Bud Light.
Bud Light tries to...
Bud Light was not supposed to be fragile. For years, it felt too big to seriously wobble. It was one of the most familiar beer brands in America. A mass-market giant. Easy to recognize, easy to buy, easy to bring to a party. The kind of brand people barely had to think about. Then one small promotional move changed everything.
Bud Light, of course, lit up social media for months after a sponsorship deal with the transgender influencer Dylan Mulvaney set off
Not a product recall, not a nationwide rebrand, not a giant ad campaign. Just one influencer activation, one post, one can, one crack in the brand. And somehow that was enough to trigger one of the ugliest brand crises of the year. Because the real disaster was not just the post itself, it was what the post exposed. A giant brand that no longer seemed to understand its own audience. A company that triggered a backlash it did not know how to control. And a response so weak that the story kept getting worse. What followed was a consumer revolt. Collapse in sales, a former market leader losing its aura of invincibility, and billions wiped off the brewer's value. This is the story of how Bud Light triggered a multi-billion-dollar backlash. Before the backlash, Bud Light was not just a beer, it was an American default. The safe, obvious, automatic choice. For decades, Bud Light built its position by being broad, familiar, and socially automatic. It was not premium, it was not niche, it was not complicated, it was just there. At barbecues, at sports parties, at tailgates, at chain restaurants, at dive bars, at college houses. That kind of position is incredibly valuable, because once a brand becomes big enough, it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like part of the landscape. That was Bud Light's real strength. It was not selling complexity, it was selling familiarity. Familiarity was the product behind the product, but familiarity creates a hidden problem. To the customer, stability. To management, stagnation. A giant mainstream brand can begin to look old, too safe, too flat, too predictable. And once that happens, management starts asking a dangerous question. How do we modernize without breaking what made us big? That was the pressure sitting underneath Bud Light long before the crisis. The brand was huge. But huge brands do not stay huge forever by accident. They stay huge by protecting the emotional contract that made them dominant in the first place. And by 2023, Bud Light seemed to be searching for a way to evolve. The problem was not that it wanted growth. The problem was that it appeared less certain about how far it could move without destabilizing the meaning people already attached to the brand. That uncertainty set the stage for everything that followed. The move that triggered the crisis looked small, at least inside a marketing deck. It was not a national packaging reset, it was not a full campaign overhaul, it was not some giant television rollout, it was a limited influencer activation tied to Dylan Mulvaney. A personalized can, a short social post, a March Madness tie-in. On paper, that may have looked manageable. A contained digital collaboration, a lightweight marketing move. The kind of thing brands do all the time. Small in scope, huge in symbolism, but brands do not live on paper. They live in public. And in public, people do not judge a brand by what executives privately intended. They judge it by what they think the brand is signaling. Intent stays inside the company. Signal escapes into public. That was the first major mistake. Bud Light appears to have treated the activation like a small tactical move. But the public did not read it that way. To a large number of people, it did not feel small at all. It felt symbolic. And once a brand action becomes symbolic, the literal size of the action stops mattering. A short post can suddenly feel like a statement. A single can suddenly feel like a repositioning. A minor activation can suddenly feel like a declaration about who the brand is now for, and who it no longer understands. That was the trap. Bud Light thought it was launching a small piece of marketing. The public saw something much bigger. And once that gap opens, the meaning of the campaign no longer belongs to the brand. It belongs to the backlash. The danger was never just that people disliked the post. The real danger was that Bud Light had drifted into a zone where its audience no longer knew what the brand was trying to be. Mass market brands live on emotional clarity. People need to understand the brand instantly, not in an academic way, in a social way. What does this brand signal? Who is it for? What kind of cultural lane does it occupy? Bud Light had spent decades building exactly that kind of clarity. It was broad, casual, mainstream, familiar, not a niche identity brand, not an experimental brand, not a prestige product. And that matters, because smaller brands can experiment more freely. Niche brands can reposition more aggressively. Trend-driven brands can absorb more symbolic volatility. Bud Light could not. Its size was built on consistency, and consistency is harder to move than marketers think. So when the activation hit the public, the reaction was not simply disagreement, it was disorientation. To critics, Bud Light did not look bold, not fresh, confused. It did not look strategically updated. It looked disconnected from the people who had made it big. And once a giant legacy brand starts looking disconnected, the reaction can escalate very quickly. Now the question was no longer, why did Bud Light do this? It became, what does Bud Light think it is now? Now the question was not the post. The question was the brand. That is a far more dangerous question. Because once the public starts questioning the meaning of the brand itself, the controversy stops being tactical. It becomes existential. This is the point where the story stops being online outrage and becomes a real brand misfire case. Because the backlash did not stay on the internet. It hit the market. Consumers pulled back. Retailers noticed. Bars and distributors felt it. Competitors benefited. And suddenly, Bud Light was no longer just defending itself in the media. It was defending itself in the market. That is a completely different kind of crisis. Public criticism can often be survived. Temporary outrage can fade. Online storms can move on. But measurable business damage changes the situation. Now the problem has a price tag. This is where outrage turns into damage. Sales fell. Momentum cracked. The brand lost ground in the category it had dominated for years. And perhaps most humiliating of all, Bud Light no longer looked untouchable. It looked vulnerable. And once a giant looks punishable, the market notices. That is a brutal transformation for a market leader. Because once customers feel that a giant brand can be punished, the brand stops feeling permanent and starts feeling exposed. It stops looking like background culture. It starts looking like a target. That is what happened here. The activation did not just trigger criticism. It exposed how quickly a dominant brand could lose control of public meaning, customer trust, and competitive confidence all at once. This was no longer a loud controversy. It was a business wound. If the activation created the spark, the response turned it into a real crisis. Because once backlash starts, the public begins asking a new set of questions. What happened? Did the company mean this? Does it stand by the move? Was this deliberate? Was this a mistake? What does the brand actually stand for now? Those questions require clarity. Bud Light answered with ambiguity. Bud Light never seemed to provide it. Instead, the company drifted into the worst possible middle ground. Too weak to reassure, too unclear to defend. To one side, it appeared to retreat. To the other, it appeared weak and insincere. To almost everyone's, it looked like management was reacting tactically instead of leading strategically. That is a terrible place for a brand to land. Because once a brand loses control of its meaning, hesitation does not calm the situation. It confirms the weakness people already suspect. Bud Light seemed unable to do any of the hard things well. It did not convincingly defend the logic. It did not convincingly reassure its base. It did not convincingly project a stable identity. It did not convincingly absorb the heat. That made the crisis worse. Now the backlash was no longer only about the original post. It was about a company that looked surprised by its own risk, uncomfortable with its own decision, and unable to project confidence once the pressure arrived. That is how manageable controversies turn into damaging brand crises. The shallow version of this story is that Bud Light made a political mistake. But that is not the deepest lesson here. The deeper mistake was strategic. Bud Light appears to have behaved as if brand meaning could be adjusted in a frictionless way. As if a giant mainstream identity could be nudged into a new cultural lane without triggering a resistance response from the audience that had emotionally anchored it for decades. That assumption was dangerous because brands do not exist only in campaigns. They exist in memory, in ritual, in habit, in accumulated symbolism. And the bigger the brand, the heavier that symbolism becomes. Bud Light was not a blank canvas. It was a loaded symbol. That means even a small move can trigger a much larger reaction than its literal scale would suggest. The company seems to have mistaken attention for permission. Visibility is not acceptance. It may have believed that a limited influencer activation would remain limited.
Today, Bud Light facing some backlash over its partnership with a trans
I got some Bud Lights for us.
$4 billion.
What does it matter? I don't really get it.
Anheuser-Busch. We put his face on a can.
You hit a Bud Light at 50 yards with a .223 and it just explodes.
This is all nuttiness.
Bud Light had been kind of a brand of bratty, kind of out of touch humor, and it was really important that we had another approach.
It may have believed that a modest digital move would be read as harmless modernization. It may have believed that a giant brand had more room to maneuver than it really did. But when a brand is deeply culturally coded, symbolic mistakes travel fast. And once the public decides that the meaning of the brand is shifting, the brand no longer controls the speed or direction of the reaction. That was the real mistake. Not simply making a controversial move, but misreading how much identity was already embedded in the brand and how costly it would be to disturb that identity without a clear plan for what came next. This crisis did not require a better apology. It required better judgment before launch. Bud Light needed to ask harder questions before making the activation public. Not just, will this get attention? But how will our core audience read this? What does this imply about the identity of the brand? If the public assigns more symbolic meaning to this than we intend, are we prepared for that? And if backlash comes, do we have the clarity and conviction to respond without looking panicked? Attention is cheap. Interpretation is expensive. Those are not ideological questions. They are brand management questions. That is what makes this case so useful. The problem was not simply that Bud Light tried something new. The problem was that it seems to have underestimated the symbolic meaning of its own brand, overestimated its room to maneuver, and then failed the leadership test once the reaction arrived. Bad answers get very expensive. That is how a small activation becomes a national controversy. That is how a controversy becomes measurable business damage. And that is how a giant brand turns one post into a full-blown brand misfire.